fabulous introduction. I feel like maybe we should just go home or read some books now. But I have to say, Craig Silvey was in the Big Weekend of Books in 2020, so if you like what you hear tonight, which you will, you can hear him in long conversation with Claire Nichols from that lovely festival. I wanted to jump in quickly. We had a lovely overview, welcome everyone, welcome Craig, from Dan about what Runt is about. But in your own words, can you tell us about where the seed for Runt came from and the kind of the story world you wanted to share that you've written?
Yeah, firstly I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm enormously grateful to see you all here. It's so wonderful to be back in a room full of people to talk about books and stories. We've all endured the pandemic. It was it was a lovely way to connect through Zoom and Teams and Facebook Live and all these things, but it's just not quite the same as being able to be in the same room. So I really am grateful that you've come out tonight. I really appreciate it. Runt, as Dan's overview suggests, tells a story of 11-year-old Annie Shearer. She lives in the town of Ups and Downs with her family on her sheep farm. She has a proclivity for fixing things. In fact, she wears an old leather tool belt with her everywhere she goes. It used to belong to her eccentric late grandfather, Wally. Annie's a solitary girl by nature, and she's comfortable in her own company. But her best and only friend is a stray dog who she rescued, whose name is Runt. Runt and Annie adore each other. Runt follows Annie everywhere she goes, and he obeys her every whim and command. And on account of his years living on the mean streets of Ups and Downs, evading capture, Runt's quite a spry, agile and athletic dog, which makes him and Annie quite a formidable team when it comes to rounding up the shearers' sheep, which are routinely breaking out in search of greener pastures. And when Annie learns that their property is under threat, her propensities want to try to fix it, and she doesn't find her solution until she stumbles across a canine agility course at the Woolorama show, and she sees these dogs running through tunnels, leaping over hurdles, weaving through slaloms, and she recognises that she and Runt might have a competitive advantage, and so she enters. And when she does so, she understands that were they to qualify for the Crumpets Dog Show in London, they could potentially earn a prize that would more than capably solve the Shearer family's financial woes. But there are a few hurdles left for them to leap over. The most prominent of which is the fact that Runt will not move. He will not obey Annie if anybody else is watching. It has to be just the two of them. And this is the hardest problem for Annie to solve. So to answer your question, the nucleus of the idea, I suppose, was a little girl and her dog, who was her best friend, who she rescued. And it was that little predicament, the fact that it wouldn't move if anybody else was there. It had to be their own little world. I didn't know the moment that it first occurred to me why that was, why it might be important. But I knew there was something there. I knew it was laden with potential. But I thought of it a few years ago, but I didn't quite have the creative space to work on it. And I kept thinking about it and nibbling on it from time to time. But it wasn't until I finished the final edits for Honeybee that I had a clean creative slate. And I wanted to work on something that felt profoundly different and was a bit of a departure. I was emotionally exhausted after writing that book. My soul was wrung out, and around the same time the pandemic hit, and we found ourselves locked in or locked out in the case of many West Australians. We were isolated. We were nursing anxieties and uncertainties and financial concerns. And at that moment, it felt intuitively right to dip my hand into the bottom drawer of my desk and pull out my notes and spend my days in the very admirable company of Annie Shearer and Runt. And I'm so glad that I did. It was a very comforting, joyous uplifting book to write and hopefully to read.
It is. It's a beautiful book. Tonight, I didn't get to say because I was so excited when we began, but we will touch on, we're going to speak about Runt for a bit, but also Jasper Jones and Honeybee and maybe even Rhubarb and other iterations of Craig's work that have made it to the big screen, that have made it to the theatre stage, but also the writing that he's doing for film and television as well, and the kind of overlap. But I wanted to stay with Runt for a minute because the way that your writing is loved by people. Jasper Jones was celebrated as a coming-of-age story. It's studied in schools, and yet I know adult after adult over the age of 45 who loved that book, who recommended that book. This book is kind of being described as a book for younger readers. And I wondered, do you agree? And what makes that different for you? How do you distinguish between your writing and who it's for?
Well, I don't think I do. I develop the stories that I get given. I don't write tailoring a narrative for a specific audience in mind. I just follow the story and I try to listen to it. I try to tap into it and I explore it, and it tells me how it wants to be written and who it might be for. I think Runt, ostensibly it's for younger readers, for middle grade readers, but I think it's a book for everybody. I hope that it's a book that the whole family can share and delight in, that parents can read to younger people, and middle grade readers can delight in and explore themselves. I think when I write, the only true barometer I have in terms of a willing audience is myself. I try to write the type of book that were I to encounter it in the wild, I might enjoy and find merit and meaning and profundity in it. And that's the only opinion that I can attend to. If I start to concern myself with the whims and opinions of hundreds of thousands of people, I'd never write another word, to be honest with you. I'd be too terrified. And so it's really an exercise in trying to displace those externalities and just get to what feels pure and just write the story.
I want to stay with Annie a bit more, and Dan gave us that beautiful description of her. She carries this tool belt, a bit like Chewbacca. Like, she's always got this tool belt, she's always fixing things, and she's a delight. She's optimistic, but she kind of carries adult worries on her shoulders. She's got a wonderful way of seeing the world. And you've also given us over the years really powerful male or boy or other children characters, but to see the world through Annie's eyes, I wondered how, you talked before about following stories. How did she come to you? How did you find her voice and her perspective?
She came to me. This is often the case with characters. You need to, in order to get to know them and to feel qualified to write about them, you need to spend time with them. You need to meet them as you would a stranger and ask them questions and get to know them, see how they might respond to any manner of things, to divine what they desire, what they want, and what might be standing in their way. And it takes time. But someone like Annie, I felt I knew intuitively. I suppose there's a lot of me in Annie. She reminds me, I suppose, a little bit of myself as a kid. She's perceptive and sensitive, and she's a bit of a worrier. I grew up in the country. Grew up on an orchard. We didn't have much. Grew up in a shed. For my 14th birthday, I asked for and received a door, which was, as you might imagine, for a 14-year-old boy, quite a useful utility. But I remember, late at night, my mother tapping away at those old adding machines with the receipts, and sneaking out there to watch her under lamplight with bills and papers around her, and absorbing her stress and absorbing her worry, and knowing that we were under considerable pressure, and wishing I could do something about it. And Annie Shearer has the same scene in Runt. And back then I didn't have a remarkable canine friend, unfortunately, to rely on to solve this particular problem. All I had was the worry. So maybe there's a bit of revisionist history here, I don't know. But I feel intimately connected to Annie, and I admire her so much. She's relentlessly hopeful, relentlessly optimistic, but her positivity doesn't seek to rewrite reality. She is a warrior, and she faces many obstacles in her journey and has to contend with those, But her hope is infectious. It certainly was for me as I was writing this book, just as it is for the characters around her. Just by being herself, Annie inspires generosity and kindness and hope in the people around her. And it's the beating heart of this story.
Well, your book also, I think it's a sign, and I mean it as the greatest compliment, reminded me of the books I loved that I read when I was a child. It took me back to, Paul Jennings, or it took me back to Roald Dahl, it took me back to Enid Blyton or to E.B. White. And one of the reasons I think great children's literature does that is there's a kind of a timelessness to the stories that you read. You don't know if they're set in 1942, like Rumer Godden's books, or for children, or 1972 or 1992. And I wondered how conscious a choice that was, because it felt to me a bit like it was set in the 1950s. There's a kind of an innocence to the small town, or a simplicity, even though it's going to hell in a handbag. But it's set in the present day in this very gentle, subtle kind of way. How conscious was that choice? How did you straddle those two things and capture that timelessness, which you do?
Yeah, well, firstly, we read similar books growing up, and they do have a whimsy and a classic feel to them, a timelessness, as you say. And I wanted to write a love letter to those stories that shaped me as a younger reader, as you say.
And you did.
Oh, thank you. Charlotte's Web, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Matilda, Paul Jennings. I was besotted with James Herriot's books, the All Creatures Great and Small series. As a younger person, I used to scour second-hand bookstores and collect them all. I don't know why. As a child, I was so intimately connected to the travails of a Yorkshire vet, but I was.
Each to their own.
Each to their own, yes, it was weird. And I also loved a book called Goodnight, Mr. Tom, by Michelle Megorian. And everyone who's familiar with that book just nods knowingly because it's so special. It's a story about a young boy, a troubled kid from London, who is billeted during the war up north to live with a curmudgeonly old widower called Tom. And it wasn't until I finished Honeybee that I realised how deeply that book had been imprinted on me, because it's a very similar template to that story. And similarly to Runt, I suppose I wanted to honour the narrative voice of the books that I adored so much as a kid. And so there's a lot of Enid Blyton, there's a lot of E.B. White in Runt, and there's a lot of Roald Dahl, particularly in his kind of high-minded, officious, judgmental streak, I suppose. I really delighted in having the opportunity to write that way, yeah.
There's a lot of humour in Runt as well, and I should say that while we reference Charlotte's Web, this has a very happy ending. There's no sad crying about the end of Creatures. But the humour in Runt, and the humour in a lot of your writing that runs all the way through Honeybee as well, and a lot of Jasper Jones with the banter between Charlie and Geoffrey. But the humour in Runt is fantastic, particularly from the names you've given to characters. There are two hysterical sort of TV anchor compares who commentate the dog show, the Crumpet Dog Show in London. They are hysterical. Basil Peppercorn and Camilla
Crown
Jewels. Yeah. They are hilarious. They are drop the book funny. And I wanted to know, how you got all those different kinds of humour on the page. Do you test out cadences? Do you read to people and see if they're going to laugh? How did you get that right? Because they're very different styles of humour throughout the book.
Oh, I'm very pleased to hear that. I adored, when I was a kid, I loved stories that made me feel things strongly. And so, I responded to tragedies, and I found the books that upset me unforgettable. But I did gravitate towards the things that made me laugh. from Paul Jennings to Roald Dahl to Mad Magazine, I collected those, and a lot of it went over my head. I didn't know much about Nixon, but for whatever reason,
he looked funny.
He looked funny. Calvin and Hobbes and Footrot Flats, and all these books I just devoured, and I really love to laugh. It's hard to get a laugh in my house. I've got some family members here who are intimately aware of my partner and intimately aware of her eye rolls, particularly when I speak. And so, I think maybe I'm overcompensating in my fiction. I don't know. I'm pleased to hear that
it's working.
Okay, that's great. I've recently become a parent, and so I'm looking forward to testing out my material on my daughter.
Captive audience.
Yes, I'm sure I'm going to get a litany of eye rolls, a chorus of eye rolls, or whatever the collective noun is.
Not until she's 7, I think 8 maybe.
Okay, I've got 8 years then to test it out. Yeah.
You write place really beautifully. It is a hallmark of your writing, and a lot of your writing is set in Western Australia. And I wondered if you could talk about what you need to do to bring a place to life. Do you need to have lived in it? You mentioned that ups and downs is maybe not entirely dissimilar to where you grew up as a child, but it runs all the way through, Jasper Jones and the town of Corrigan and Honeybee as well. Why do you set things in Western Australia, and what do you need in order to make that place feel real for people who haven't been there?
Well, Western Australia is it's my home. It's in my blood. I'm quite a parochial West Australian, and it's distinct. We are our own ecosystem over there, and we are blessed with extraordinary landscapes and diverse landscapes. I grew up in the country, and so I'm intimately aware of the senses of the place, not just how things look, but how they feel, how they smell, how they sound. And it's always fascinated me, the opportunity that novels give us to transport us. However, I do also think that it's important to leave enough room in the margin for people to imprint their own experiences, their own histories, their own notions into a story. And so I suspect that sometimes why these places feel so familiar, because they are a stylised version of Western Australia, particularly Jasper Jones and Runt, when it's called Ups and Downs, is that a reader builds it themselves, and they imbue it with their own histories, their own thoughts, their own memories, and that's what makes it feel intimate.
Your writing is, in all your stories, is undeniably Australian. And it sounds like, from what you just said, a parochial man from Western Australia. Like it's a conscious choice. And Runt continues that theme, that style of setting this story. And I wondered if you could talk about how you capture that voice. And I felt it again when I was reading Runt. When I went back and read Jasper Jones, I thought, how would I feel if I was in Nebraska? Like, how would I understand this language, especially in Jasper Jones, your truncation, the way that the teenagers speak, or that people spoke in a smaller town.
Right.
How do you capture that Australian voice, and why is it important to you?
Well, firstly, if you were in Nebraska and you picked up the US edition of Jasper Jones, you would have a handy glossary at the back. Which you could employ. Yes, that's
wow.
right.
God forbid.
Yeah, well, we did have to go through and change serviettes to napkins, because, how on earth would you possibly know what they were wiping their mouth with? And so, there is a little bit lost in translation.
Wow.
Yes, yeah. I fought very hard to have a serviette, but I lost that battle. I love language. I love the music of words and the rhythm of sentences, and I love listening to people speak, and I love how language shifts. I love slang, particularly country slang. I love the idiosyncrasies of country life as well. The fact that kind of isolation leads to social and cultural idiosyncrasy. It's very curious to me. The understatements, the dry humour, The spirit that underpins these words, you know, it's very, very interesting to me. And if you're a novelist, if you are interested in what language can do and how it can change geographically, that's the stuff you want to capture. That's the stuff you want to listen to. And these are the things that you collect over time, that you look for an opportunity to build upon in your work. It's also what makes characters feel rich and distinct. You know, so you're always looking for these things. So it's really about listening and trying to distill that on the page.
And you do capture something very quintessential about Australian character, kind of a no-nonsense, a dryness, a sardonic kind of tone. It's wonderful.
I think we see it a lot in Annie's grandma. Her name is Dolly. You know, I was raised by a long line of tough old broads, and I suppose Dolly is a bit of an amalgam of those. You know, she's an ex-boxer. She's loyal. She's ferocious. She's kind. She's roll your sleeves up, adventurous. She's also looking for love in all the wrong places. She's on an app called Widower, and she's going nowhere.
Told you it was funny.
But you know, she is prepared to make sacrifices, and she adores her family, and she cares about what matters. You know, and she's civic-minded. You know, she reminds me of my mum. She reminds me of my grandmother and my old Auntie Doll, and these people who grew up in these country towns and just had that spirit about them. You know, so I had a lot to draw from.
I want to ask you a couple of questions that are sort of more broadly about your body of work as well, and we can keep on touching on Runt as well. A lot of your books are about children in adult worlds. You know, Charlie and Jasper Jones. Sam in Honeybee, and now Annie in Runt. And it's children trying to navigate adult worlds, not switched off to it, not trying to pretend that the world is a kind or gentle place, but really grappling with, in some cases, the darkness and the violence of what the adult world entails, what the world can entail. But I wondered if you think about the kind of the contrast you're drawn to when you look at how your stories have evolved over time. So I think when I think about Jasper Jones and the way that story is really all about all the scales falling from his eyes. That first witnessing of something violent reveals to him the darkness that is in the world. And Sam's experience of the world, which is punctuated by so much violence and hardship, as well as pockets of kindness. And then in Runt, I feel like we're kind of getting this evolving worldview, I suppose I'm asking you about. Are you conscious of that? I feel like the world that you're showing us on the page is kind of kinder, it's becoming kinder, or you're focusing more on the goodness people can do for each other.
That's a lovely way to put it. It's very perceptive, to the extent that I feel unqualified to comment.
Oops.
You can take it from here. You know, I suppose they're thematically intertwined. Firstly, I do think hope is important in fiction. Just as it is important to authentically depict trauma, and the two coexist. If we're going to try to distill what life is like, particularly for people who are marginalised and displaced, but hope is important. I think it's what novels should offer us, or certainly leave us with. You know, Jasper Jones was about a boy whose bubble of protection was burst by the adult world, and it was about him grappling with that, trying to make sense of that, trying to recognise his position in the world and what the world is like for other people. In meeting Jasper Jones and in contending with this very adult problem, Charlie grows up, he matures. And I suppose the broader point that the book was making is that not everybody goes through that process. You know, some people continue to coddle themselves with that layer of protection. They lie to themselves. This is why secrets and myths and toxic tropes can pervade over time as a layer of protection. In Honeybee, Sam never has that bubble. You know, it's not even burst. She lives in quite a traumatic circumstance, and if anything, she learns what comfort and support and love is. She becomes aware of some of the beautiful aspects of life and what acceptance and understanding can catalyse within somebody who doesn't have a high opinion of themselves, who's in denial about their authentic self. And so it's almost a reverse process, I suppose, you know. She doesn't lie to herself, but she's kinder to herself, and that allows her to take a more optimistic path. I think in Runt, Annie is the beating heart of this story. She is the hope, and she and her infectiousness brings people in, and inspires change in a town that is in a state of decay and decline. People are losing hope, but Annie and her little pal, who was once maligned in this town, become heroes.
It's a beautiful answer, thank you. The other thing you do really well is you mix genres up all the time in your writing. You know, we're reading an Australian Gothic, and then it's really funny, and then it's about cricket. And and the same in Runt. You know, there's kind of corruption, and there's environmental a big environmental allegory in Runt that's really beautifully described and unpicked, and unravelled, and I don't want to kind of ruin it for anyone. About the natural resources, and about land, and about local history, and but I wonder, when you're writing, kind of a writerly question, do you feel like there are styles or genres that come more easily to you? Are you conscious of sort of flipping between them, or is that just are you attracted to stories that do the same thing? They're not all not all darkness or murder or Gothic.
Yeah.
But your books are a really big mix of different genres and sometimes different styles as well.
Again, I'm unqualified to comment. I think I lack the awareness to understand that as it's unfurling. I very rarely write from outside the story. You make critical decisions about structure and character, about what the story ultimately might be. You make decisions that adhere to craft, but the creation of the novel happens almost subconsciously, if that makes any sense. That's certainly when it feels the most honest. That's when it feels the most pure. It's a difficult thing to explain, the creative process that undergirds a novel. The best way I can describe it to you is that a writer needs to occupy a similar space that a reader might. We're all readers, I assume. When we pick up a novel and breathe life into it, we are spellbound by a story. We're mesmerised. We abandon our own identity in favour of any number of others. We forget who we are, we forget what time it is, and we exist inside this fictional dreamscape that feels inordinately real to us. A novelist needs to enter that space, need to create that space, but reserve enough of themselves to record it at the same time. And it's a very, very difficult place to get to. There's no map, there's no road that leads there. You almost have to sort of inveigle yourself into this world. It's like trying to fall asleep with your eyes open. And so it takes a great deal of patience to get there. And when you are there, you let the story happen to you. I often feel like a conduit for a story, as though it always existed, and I was the fortunate vessel through which it could manifest itself. I always think of Paul McCartney writing the song Yesterday on the piano. and he couldn't believe that it wasn't an old standard. He kept playing it for other people, saying, "What is this song? I've heard it before." But it was his. He created it. But it felt timeless. It felt as though he'd pulled it from the ether. And that is when a novel works the best. That's when it feels the most pure, when you have been given it, when characters dictate the terms, and when a novel moves of its own accord and momentum. And it's a humbling process. And so, in and of the moment, you don't concern yourself with questions about genre. You don't concern yourself with any of the externalities of writing. That comes later when you're editing. That's that aspect of it. But in and of the moment, you've just got to trust that the story will come to you, and you've got to keep that focus and try to get it down. It's why it takes so much time. It's why it requires so much patience to write a novel, and they happen by degrees. You can work for hours and hours over the course of a day and end up with a paragraph and be exhausted by it. That's why, for me, it takes so much time.
Thank you. I want to take you one book back to Honeybee, because it was a book that kind of, it sounds like you reached into your heart and it reached into our hearts. That was the experience of a lot of people who read it. And you said you were, very drained at the end of it. And it's maybe a little bit different to what you just described. It sounds like the writing process might have been one where it came to you and you followed it in with no map in and no map out. But you said before that you had tour guides, which I thought was such a great way of describing it, who helped you navigate some of the pockets of that land. And I wanted to ask you if you could tell us about who those tour guides were and what they taught you about how to write that story.
Sure. Honeybee tells the story of a young trans teenager who we first meet late one night when she climbs over the rail of a traffic bridge late one night with the intention of ending her life. But at the other end of the bridge, there's an old man. His name is Vic, and he's there for the same reasons. The two see each other across the void, and it changes their fates. They meet, and the story documents the relationship that blooms between the two of them. Now, my lived experience is not the same as Honeybee's, as Sam's. I'm not a trans person, and I recognise that this is a privilege that I have. I don't navigate the world with the same pressures and threats and risks as people in the trans and gender diverse community. And in wanting to authentically distill Sam's experience, what it required of me was to listen and to learn, but most importantly to collaborate and consult with members of the community, to bring them in and to ask them questions, to listen to their histories and their testimonies, and to seek out their intimate knowledge, so that I could authentically, respectfully, sensitively and carefully tell Sam's story. And I was enormously fortunate to have many people of various ages and backgrounds and experiences honour me with their time and their stories. And that's ultimately what built Sam's character. That's what gave me the bedrock of her story. As it relates to manifestations of Sam's dysphoria or what she's contending with, how it feels to navigate the world as a young trans person, everything was informed by their testimony. Nothing was left to imagination. I did have other tour guides. There are scenes in Honeybee which document the world of drag in Perth. I'm not a drag queen, and so I needed some tour guides. I needed some people to guide me through the world of Perth drag. I wanted to capture those idiosyncrasies, the language, the gossip, the world of Perth drag. And I had some wonderful tour guides. One of whom was Veronica Jean Jones. Another one was Sky Scraper, all 6'6" of her. And we had some amazing nights. It was quite incredible. And I learned so much. I learned some really interesting things, some really juicy things. A lot of stuff that was unexpected, that made it into the book. Honeybee is set in 2017. And I was fascinated to learn of this fractious rivalry between drag queens and hens nights. Drag queens typically do not appreciate hens. And I didn't quite understand why until it was made abundantly clear to me that hens, bridal parties typically favour LGBTQI venues. The reason for this is that they're less likely to be sort of aggressed upon and hit on, and they can let their hair down and go crazy. However, in 2017, the insensitivity of going to a queer venue to celebrate your impending nuptials in front of people who didn't have that fundamental right was extraordinarily tone deaf. And it gave me the opportunity to put some words in the mouth of a drag queen called Luna Moons, who's very funny, and who's a bit of a comedy queen. And she dresses down quite savagely a hen's night at a drag club. That was a lot of fun. I learned things about human biology. I watched tucking tutorials, and I watched it being done. It's quite extraordinary. I learned things about myself that I didn't know. There's a process known as putting the eggs in the nest. For those of you who have them, we can actually invite the eggs inside ourselves, and after that, in order to create the illusion, you will then boat tape your member up yourself. And I couldn't believe this. Couldn't believe it. I had this ability, this extraordinary ability, and I have to say that I got a bit method. I tested it out, and I'm pleased to say, up they went. There was a moment of panic where I thought they might not come back down, but fortunately here we are. As I say, I've just had a daughter.
Exactly. Very good.
So I learned a lot, is my point.
Now, you had amazing tour guides, and you became a great tour guide for us. And there's a lot in that book, and I'm going to move on because we're running out of time before your questions. But that book touches on, as you said, the tone deafness of who has rights and who doesn't. It touches on how we treat teenagers in general. Like, there's a whole thing about how we treat children, what we assume children can't feel and can't see when they clearly can on both fronts. And there's also a huge theme in there that you mentioned to me about euthanasia, which I was very struck by. And I felt, if people have read the book, there's a character, Vic, who has been sick for a long time and lonely for a long time, who doesn't want to be here anymore. And his story mirrors Sam's story. And Sam doesn't yet have the right to choose her fate. And Vic sort of doesn't have the right to choose his. There are these wonderful other parallels in the book. So if anyone hasn't yet picked it up, it's out the back at the bookstore at the end. I wanted to ask you quickly about writing for other mediums. We've talked about, you write different, books for children, books that are darker, books for adults, books about putting the eggs in the nest, the whole range of things. But you've also been writing screenplays. You adapted Jasper Jones into a screenplay in 6 weeks, which for people who don't know anything about filmmaking is insanely short in terms of an amount of time to write a screenplay. But you're also working on other screenplays, and I wondered if you could tell us what you've learned about how you write by taking your novel and writing it for the screen, how you work out what gestures to translate.
They're entirely different mediums, You're trying to communicate the same thing, but you're doing it via another language. The other thing about a screenplay is that it's a blueprint for a specific number of people. It's not for broad public consumption. It's a tool. It's there to be useful for various departments that are tasked with bringing a film to life. Be they costume departments, be they production, be they actors or directors. And so the difficulty is trying to make a script come alive, to have it feel evocative, but also give it utility, I suppose. There are rigidities to screenwriting that do not suit a novelist's sensibility. And so it's not really where I tend to create, I have to say. When I develop work for screen, typically I'll actually write a really detailed treatment that's almost novelistic in its tone, because that's the instrument through which I create the best. It's where I have the most creative leeway. It's where my mind can sort of drift off the best. Under the rigidities of the screenplay format, I find it too restrictive, too constricting, and I can't quite create the same way. But I really adore the challenge. I think, beyond anything else, what developed me the most as a writer was actually sitting in on the edit of Jasper Jones with an extraordinary editor. She's done so many films. Her name is Veronica Genet. And she's a very officious German woman who takes no prisoners. And so to see her cut that film together brutally, I felt, was really enlightening. I realised how often I repeat myself, or repeat a beat, and I learned how to respect the audience a lot more, to leave room in the margins. Watching a film get edited together, I think is a really teachable moment for any writer. It's a really useful process to go through, and it's I think it's made me a cleaner writer. It's helped me structure things a bit better. She's a genius. She's really brilliant. So these days, the two work almost hand in hand. I actually wrote Runt as a manuscript and a screenplay largely at the same time, and they both helped each other, I suppose. In terms of structure, in terms of development. It's hard to create robust characters in a screenplay format, to be honest with you, because you need to leave so much room for an actor to come and interpret them and bring them to life. But it was helpful for me to write the novel, to get an intuitive, a real sense of who these people were. But in terms of structuring the novel and keeping it really taut, adhering to a screenplay format was really, really useful. It was an interesting way to write.
Are we going to see an adaptation of Honeybee?
I'm very hopeful. I've sold the option to Honeybee to a wonderful producer. They're very busy at the moment making Boy Swallows Universe for Netflix. But our strategy going forward is to develop Honeybee as a 6-part series for a streaming platform. Who that is at this point in time, we don't know. But that development should start hopefully early next year. We're just assembling our writers' room at the moment, and fingers crossed we can get our ducks in a row and get some partnerships together, and we can get that up and running.
I want to ask you one more question, and then I promise we're coming to yours. So I hope you've been keeping them in mind as we go along. You mentioned before that you've just had a new child, and we don't get to see you all that often in this part of the world because you're writing. And I suppose I want to ask, what helps you write and what gets in the way of your writing? I don't mean that small children do, but I'm wondering what inspires
well, they do.
you to
I mean, let's be honest, they certainly
Except
do.
when they laugh at your jokes, then it's fine. But,
well, not yet. I get a lot
true.
of grumpy looks. That's really been what I've had thus far as a father. Everything that is not me sitting in a room writing is an impediment to my writing.
That's problematic.
It's not a healthy way to live. But that is the truth. Writing a novel is an exercise of obsession. It never leaves you. And you find yourself straddling the fictional universe that you're trying to cultivate, whilst also trying to navigate the real world that you have responsibilities and relationships in. And it's a very, very difficult balance to find. In my 20s and early 30s, I'll be honest with you, it wasn't particularly healthy. I was particularly attuned to writing stories, and I lost myself in it, to the point where there was a day where I was moving out and I packed up my home, and my life was in boxes, and I realised that it didn't nourish me the way that I thought it might. Felt profoundly hollow, especially when I came to Sydney, and my partner and I determined that we should try and make it work, and it actually enriched my writing. And I suspect that having a daughter, having a family, will do the same thing. It's just about trying to find that balance and trusting in it. And I actually think that ultimately it will help my fiction.
Lovely. It's time for your questions. We don't have a roving mic, but if you tell me your question, I will repeat it for the people who are with us on the live stream. Are there questions for Craig? Yeah.
You spoke about the editing process for screenplays, but what's your editing process for your books? Because you talked a lot about how they come to you and you write them down, but what happens next?
So for people online, that question was about the editing process for books. So what's Craig's process for that?
I have to be very careful here because my editor is sitting a metre away from me. It's a delight, is what it is. There are never any arguments. It's wonderful, and my books are always improved. I don't bear grudges about lost chapters, dream sequences 12 years after the fact, at all. No, actually it is delightful. I actually really love the first stage of editing, that first edit that I do independently. So you finish the manuscript, then you cry a bit. People often think that it's a really triumphant, joyous moment to finish a first draft of a manuscript, but it's not. You actually just feel profoundly empty. You feel hollowed out and wrung out, and it takes you a little bit of time to recover. It's like you've removed an organ. You've had a novelectomy. But editing is this beautiful process because there's no fear when you turn up to the desk every day. There's no fear that you won't get to that place where you can create something. There's no fear that it's not going to work, that you won't reach the end. You're not nursing doubts the same way that ordinarily you might. All you have to do is work and improve and burnish and polish and trim. And I find it a really thorough and exacting process. I like it. From that point on, it's ready for other impressions. And that's a fascinating moment. I'm very fortunate in that I have the best editor in the country. I really do, and I'm not just saying that because I'm frightened right now. I really do. Jane Polferman is the best in the business. She really is. And I get excited when I hear Jane's impressions and her notes because I know that it's only going to get better. And I know that when it comes time for line edits and deeper edits with Ali Laveau, that it's just going to be even more resonant. It's gonna sing even more. So I've come to really adore the process. What helps is that if you can just divorce your personal feelings from the text, and just treat it like a story. It's nothing is a personal attack. It's not an indictment on you as a person. Everybody is working to make the story better. And working in film has helped that too. It's a very collaborative process, and you've just got to divorce your feelings from your ideas. And once you do that, it becomes a lot easier.
There's another question down the back. Yes, thank you.
I just wondered when I think about coming of age books, I think about Edmonton's Breath and also The Shepherd's Heart. And I notice in those they seem somewhat bleaker. I mean, they're telling similar sort of coming of age stories, but they're much better. Is it important to you to have more empathy or a softer side in your writing?
So So that was a question about coming of age stories and the importance of having empathy in them, that some coming of age stories, the Tim Winton ones, have this kind of bleakness and darkness to them. Craig?
Well, I have to do something to delineate myself from Tim Winton. I had to cut the ponytail off, that's gone now. I took that. Stopped my surfing career, it's gone. No more fishing.
You've got to make sacrifices, right?
Exactly right, and my books are hopeful. And it's, all as a response to that man. No, I just think it's important. It's part of life, and I think it's what books should ultimately give us. Things don't need to feel unearned. Honeybee leaves us on a very optimistic note, but there's still work to do. Victoria faces real challenges, and these are presented in the text. She is empowered by the end. There is a paradigm shift in her key relationships. She earns that ending and that positivity, but it's not some Pollyanna dream. There's a long way for her to go. Jasper Jones, I feel, it has quite a somber ending. Jasper Jones can't remain in that town. The secrets remain. Charlie gets the girl, but he's relatively traumatized as well. And so it's a bit like the rest of the book. The light and the dark are interchangeable, where we have those emotional dynamics, and they're just particularly resonant at the end. Runt, I have to say, is a particularly happy ending. There's a lot of darkness in the world right now, but Runt, I think, is just a big ray of sunshine.
Other questions for Craig before we wrap up? We've got time for a few more. Thank you.
I'm a Year 6 teacher, and we do lots of creative writing. I'm wondering if there's any golden rules of storytelling that I could pinch and take back to the kids.
So that for people listening online, that was about are there golden rules or tips of storytelling, of great storytelling that he can teach his Year 6 students?
The golden rule of writing is that there are no rules. Particularly when you're 11 years old. Write for the joy in it. Write for the thrill in discovery. Write to examine something about yourself. Write to interrogate something that you don't know. Write to explore and to have an adventure and to give someone else an experience. What a glorious thing that is for us to be able to hand a document over to somebody else in order for them to have a profound emotional response. How beautiful is that? The only way that you can develop a voice that feels sincere and distinct as a writer is to just write, is to do it. When I was 14 years old, my life was changed by a writer who came to my school. His name is Glenn Parry. He wrote young adult novels. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a writer. Up until that point, they'd been sort of distant deities. These kind of whimsical, wispy, far-off figures. And I didn't actually appreciate that someone could actually apply themselves and be a writer, become a writer, as a vocation. And it was an enormously clarifying moment. I knew who I was, and I resolved then and there to write. And that's what I did. After I got my door, I closed it, and I wrote an awful novel. Terrible. It's called The Drug Warden. Available next Christmas, I think. Sent it to James. Very optimistic. But I sent the manuscript alongside an impassioned letter to Glyn, detailing my dedication to words and the craft, and I told him that I wanted to become a writer. And I sweated on his response every day I'd go to the Dwelling Up post office, and every day I would leave disappointed. There was no letter for me. Until one day there was. And it remains a treasured artefact of my life. He said it was a scary, beautiful decision that I'd made. Scary because there's no life harder than that of the novelist. But beautiful because there's no more rewarding life. But he also gave me a piece of advice that's never left me. And he said, don't become a writer, be a writer. And that's really what it's all about. You've just got to write. You've got to read and you've got to write. You've just got to practice the craft. Same way that an athlete needs to run and develop skills, you've got to just get in there and put in the work and divine your own ways of bringing stories to life. There is no golden rule. There is no one way to do it. I'm mystified by the methods of the writers that I know who are enormously successful, but they just found a way that worked for them. It's a really intrinsic, personal thing to bring a story to life, and there's no clear way to do it. It's what makes them so elusive. That's not going to help your 11-year-olds at all. Not one bit. My apologies.
But we appreciate it. You will have time when you meet Craig afterward at the book table. You will have time to chat with him there as well. But we do have time for one more quick question, if there is one. And if you don't have one, I have one. Yep, off the back. Thank you.
I read a little while ago that it's quite contentious to write stories from the first person point of view that we don't necessarily share in our own experience. I was really hoping to get some more thoughts on that, especially because I found Honeybee so empathetic and moving.
That was a question about what the challenges and problems are, or the contentiousness of writing from the first person if the experience is not your own.
I think the further the story drifts from an author's lived experience, the deeper your responsibility to do the work and to research and connect with people in that community, particularly if that community has a history of misrepresentation, as the trans community has. The history of trans representation in the media is a history of damage, dehumanisation and exploitation. And so in recognising that, my first and most important impression was to do no harm. And so to do that, I needed to listen. I needed to learn. I needed to connect with people in that community. It was genuinely a chorus of voices that allowed me to write that story. I want to be very clear that Honeybee doesn't seek to broadly explain a trans experience, to distill a broad experience. Honeybee is about one specific character with a very specific set of pressures and concerns in a very specific place and time. The story is Sam's, the story is Victoria's, the story is Honeybee's. Her story is underpinned by the lives and experiences of the people who contributed to the book. And furthermore, if you're writing from beyond your lived experience and trying to articulate that experience, to do so sensitively and carefully, it needs to be underpinned by a clear intention. My intention in writing Honeybee was manifold. Firstly, I wanted to give young trans and gender diverse people an opportunity to read a contemporaneous novel in Australia that represented them and galvanised them and gave them an opportunity to be seen and respected. Beyond that, for readers who are outside that community, I wanted Honeybee to provide an emotional framework to which they could better understand the challenges that are faced by trans and gender diverse people in Australia, and to recognise how we are all implicated in making the lives of trans and gender diverse people safer. I also wrote Honeybee seeking to answer a question, and that question was, How does somebody like Sam, or somebody similarly poised, climb back over the rail of that traffic bridge onto a more optimistic and hopeful path? And through the length and breadth of my research and from consultation with the community, one theme continued to echo back at me, and that was the importance of support and love and understanding and acceptance. And that is what Honeybee is about. Sam is protected by and supported by, quite literally, a supporting cast. From Vic to Aggie Mimaduma, her friend across the road, to a very maternal drag queen called Fella Fitzgerald, to a therapist, Diane, who offers clinical support. And they offer her a catalyst for change. And it's certainly true that support has an appreciable difference in the lives of trans and gender diverse people. And so we are all responsible for making our spaces safer for trans and gender diverse people. So I wanted to inspire people to be better allies. And thirdly, it's about execution. It has to be a good book. You have to execute those ideas properly. And I suppose the only way you're going to find that out is to hear how it's received and to listen to the conversation that emerges from it. Yeah. And with those three things underpinning your work, I think any artist, be it a novelist, an actor, a painter, can present work ethically.
Brilliant. I don't think you were being falsely modest, but you talked with great frankness about not knowing sometimes where stories come from and following them in and out. But it is a sign of stories that come to us at the right time, which I think all of your books have, but particularly Runt and also particularly Honeybee, that powerful stories shake us up and they make us ask those questions about what we read and what we can imagine. And I'm going to hand over to Dan, but I wanted to say thank you for all of these story worlds. Thank you for shaking us up, for making us feel, for making us laugh, and for making us see the world differently. Please join me in thanking Craig Silvey.